The sound isn't what you'd expect. People think extreme cold is silent, but it's the loudest thing I've ever heard. It's the sound of the air itself cracking, a high-pitched metallic whine that vibrates inside your teeth. At 40 degrees, the world stops being a place and starts being an enemy.
Fahrenheit or Celsius, it doesn't matter. This is where the scales meet, and where biology begins to fail. I was standing on the edge of a frozen industrial wasteland when the door slammed shut behind me. No supplies, no specialized gear. Just the clothes on my back and a realization that hit harder than the wind.
I had approximately 4 minutes before my dexterity vanished, and maybe 20 before my core temperature began its terminal slide. The wind chill factor pushed the effective temperature down into the 60s. At this level, exposed skin freezes in less than 30 seconds. It's called frostnip first, a deceptive whitening of the skin, but it turns into deep tissue frostbite before you even feel the pain. My lungs burned with every breath. The moisture in my exhaled air was crystallizing instantly, coating my eyelashes in a heavy, blinding frost. I scanned the horizon. Nothing but rusted, corrugated metal and the skeletal remains of an old quarry. There was no wood to burn, no structures left with intact roofs. In the Arctic, or any extreme sub-zero environment, your primary enemy isn't the cold itself, it's heat loss. Specifically, convective heat loss from the wind and conductive heat loss from the ground. Then I saw it. A dark, jagged indentation in the frozen earth near the base of a concrete retaining wall. It wasn't a cave, it wasn't a cellar, it was a hole. A narrow, vertical shaft leading into the blackness of the permafrost. To most people, it looked like a grave. To a survivalist, it was a thermal sanctuary. In survival physics, the Earth is a massive thermal battery. While the air temperature was screaming at 40 degrees Celsius, the ground just a few feet down remains relatively stable, often hovering around the freezing mark, 0 degrees Celsius. That 40-degree differential is the difference between a quick death and a fighting chance. I didn't hesitate. I dropped to my knees, the frozen gravel tearing at my pants, and slid into the dark. The descent was tight. The walls were a mix of packed clay and jagged stone, frozen solid as granite. As I lowered myself, the screaming howl of the wind began to muffle. The air became heavy, smelling of damp minerals and old, stagnant cold. This wasn't warm, far from it, but the absence of the wind felt like a warm blanket in comparison. I reached the bottom, maybe 8 feet down. My boots hit soft, loose earth. I was in a crawl space, a pocket of air trapped between the world of the living and the deep freeze of the earth. I checked my watch. 6 minutes had passed since I was thrown out. My fingers were already becoming wooden, the fine motor skills required to strike a match or tie a knot beginning to erode. This is the umbra of survival, the short window where you still have the cognitive and physical ability to save yourself. If I didn't turn this hole into a functional microclimate within the next hour, I wouldn't be walking out. I am alone. I am under the earth, and the battle for every single calorie of body heat has just begun. Welcome to the bottom of the world. Act 2. The Thermal Stratification and the Art of Entrance Control. I was 8 feet deep in a lightless chamber, but the air was still too cold to breathe comfortably. Why? Because cold air is denser than warm air, it's heavy, it sinks. Without a proper entrance seal, my hole was nothing more than a cold trap, a gravity-fed drain for the sub-zero air pouring down from the surface. To survive, I had to understand and manipulate the fluid dynamics of air. At the surface, I could hear the wind howling, a sound like a low-flying jet engine. That wind creates a venturi effect, sucking the warmer air out of any cavity and replacing it with the brutal, freezing current. I had to close the door, but I had no door. My first task was to create a cold sump. A sump is a lower level where the heaviest, coldest air can settle, leaving the slightly warmer air at my body level. I used my boot to kick at the floor of the hole, carving out a secondary depression about a foot deep near the entrance shaft. As I did, I could feel the invisible waterfall of freezing air from above cascading into that new pocket. Next, the entrance. I looked up. The sky was a narrow square of bruised purple. I needed a cap. I reached back up the shaft, pulling at the frozen, rusted debris scattered around the rim. I found a piece of old corrugated metal and some discarded insulation foam, remnants of the industrial site. I dragged the sheet of metal across the opening, leaving only a tiny sliver for air exchange. This was the first rule of sub-zero shelters. Insulation is secondary to air tightness. You can't heat a room that's leaking its volume every 10 seconds. But with the seal came a new danger: carbon dioxide poisoning. In a confined space, especially one with a low ceiling, your own breath becomes a toxin. Every exhale is roughly 4% CO2. Without a chimney or a vent, the concentration rises, leading to dizziness, lethargy, and finally, a sleep you never wake up from. I used a piece of discarded PVC pipe I found near the hole's entrance to create a venturi vent, a small tube angled toward the prevailing wind. The wind blowing across the top of the tube would pull the stale air out, while a smaller gap at the bottom allowed fresh air to enter the cold sump. The air in the hole began to change. It wasn't warm. It was still well below freezing, but it was stagnant. And in survival, stagnant air is your best friend. Stagnant air is an insulator. Now, I had to deal with the ground. Conductivity is the silent killer. If I sat directly on the frozen earth, it would suck the heat out of my core 30 times faster than the air would. I was losing thermal energy through my feet and my backside with every second of contact. I spent the next 20 minutes frantically gathering any biomass or refuse within reach of my entrance. Cardboard, old plastic sheeting, even handfuls of dry, frozen moss. I layered these onto the floor of my shelter. The goal was to create a thermal break, a series of air pockets between me and the ground. As I lay down on my makeshift bed, I could feel my body beginning to shake. This was good. Shivering is the body's involuntary muscle contraction to generate heat. It's a sign that your metabolic furnace is still firing. But shivering is expensive. It burns through your glycogen stores at an incredible rate. I checked my pocket. A single energy bar. Maybe 250 calories. In this environment, I was burning 500 calories an hour just to stay alive. I was in a massive caloric deficit, and the night hadn't even truly begun. I looked at the walls of my hole. They were shimmering with frost. I realized that the moisture from my breath was beginning to sublimate directly into ice crystals on the walls. If that ice layer got too thick, it would actually help insulate the hole, creating a snow cave effect. But for now, I was a human space heater trying to warm up a walk-in freezer with a single candle's worth of energy. The physics were against me. The environment was hostile. And the psychological weight of being buried alive was starting to press down as hard as the cold. Act 3. The combustion. Chokehold in the candle power of life. In the sub-zero dark, you lose sense of time, but you never lose sense of the cold. It's like a predator that doesn't just bite, it swallows. My hands were now useless for anything delicate. I was experiencing Hunting's reaction, a cycle of blood vessels constricting to protect the core, then dilating slightly to prevent tissue death in the extremities. It's a painful, rhythmic throbbing that feels like needles being driven into your nail beds. I had a single light source, a waterproof lighter. It was low on fuel. I also had a small, half-empty can of Sterno, denatured alcohol gel, I'd found in my pocket. This wasn't a furnace. It was a lifeline. But in an enclosed space like my hole, fire is a double-edged sword. To burn anything, you need oxygen. And in a sub-zero environment, combustion creates water vapor. This is the condensation paradox. Fire makes you warmer, but it also makes the air more humid. And in 40, humidity is a death sentence. Wet skin or clothing loses heat 25 times faster than dry. I set the Sterno can on a flat rock in the center of the hole. I struck the lighter. The flame was a tiny, ethereal blue, flicking in the stagnant air. The immediate visual change, the orange glow on the frozen clay walls, felt like a spiritual experience. A single candle or a sterno can provides about 75 to 100 BTUs, British thermal units, of heat per hour. A human body at rest produces about 300–400 BTUs. Combined, we were putting out maybe 500 BTUs. In a large room, that's nothing. But in a 3-foot wide hole, it's a miracle. The temperature in the thermal bubble near the ceiling of my hole began to rise. I watched the thermometer on my watch. 20 degrees, 10 degrees, 5 degrees. But as the air warmed, the frost point began to shift. The frost on the walls started to sublimate, turning directly from ice into water vapor. I could feel the air getting heavy and damp. If that moisture condensed on my clothing, I was finished. Once your insulation, even a simple jacket, gets damp, its R value, thermal resistance, drops to nearly zero. I had to manage the dew point of my own environment. I used my knife to carve a drip line, a series of shallow grooves in the ceiling that would channel any melting water away from my body and toward the cold sump I'd dug earlier. The sterno was also my only way to get water. In 40, dehydration is a major killer. You don't feel thirsty, but the dry air is literally sucking the moisture out of your lungs with every breath. You're losing liters of water through insensible perspiration and respiration. I took an old tin can I found in the debris and filled it with clean snow from the entrance shaft. Melting snow is an energy-intensive process. It takes as much energy to turn ice into 0 degrees Celsius water as it does to turn 0 degrees Celsius water into 80 degrees Celsius hot water. It's called the latent heat of fusion. I held the tin can over the tiny sterno flame. The snow hissed and shrank. I had to be careful not to pack it too tightly, or it would form an insulating layer of air, and the bottom of the can would burn out. After 10 minutes, I had half a cup of lukewarm, metallic-tasting water. I sipped it slowly. The warmth hit my stomach like a lightning strike. It was a tiny victory. But in this hole, victories are measured in sips and degrees. The light from the sterno was also revealing more about my tomb. The hole wasn't a natural formation. I could see the marks of an excavator's teeth in the frozen clay. This was a geotechnical test pit, abandoned and forgotten. I was sitting in a man-made scar on the face of the earth. And as the sterno's fuel level dropped, I realized that my miracle was temporary. When the flame died, the cold would come back with a vengeance, and the humidity I'd just created would turn into a layer of ice on my skin. I had to find another way to store the heat. I needed a thermal mass. Act 4. The thermal mass and the thermodynamics of stones. The sterno was flickering. Its blue flame was a dying heartbeat. I had maybe 10 minutes of active heat left before the temperature in my hole would plummet back to the ambient 40. I needed to store the energy. In the physics of survival, there is active heating, like fire, and passive storage, like thermal mass. Thermal mass is a material's ability to absorb, store, and slowly release heat. I looked at the floor of my hole. It was mostly frozen clay and some river-run stones, smooth, fist-sized rocks that had been turned by glaciers 10,000 years ago. Stones have a high, specific heat capacity compared to air. They're like batteries for temperature. I grabbed 4 of the largest stones and began to pile them around the sterno's tiny flame. I was careful not to smother it. I needed to maximize the surface area contact between the fire and the stones. This is the conduction matrix. As the stones warmed up, they began to radiate infrared energy. If you've ever sat near a wood stove that's gone out, you've felt this, the heat that stays in the cast iron long after the wood is ash. I watched the clock. My sterno was a caloric bomb that was about to go off. I had to time its death perfectly. While the stones were charging, I needed to improve my personal insulation. Your clothing doesn't make you warm. It just traps the heat you're already generating. But at 40, the R value of even a heavy parka is only about 3 or 4. I needed more loft, the thickness of the air trapped inside my clothes. I reached into the debris I'd pulled from the surface. I found some old, damp-looking insulation foam and a handful of dry, wind-blown grass. I stuffed these into the layers of my jacket and pants. It looked ridiculous. I was a bloated, lumpy scarecrow in a hole, but it was working. Every inch of loft I added was another 10 degrees of thermal protection for my core. Then, the sterno sputtered and died. The darkness was sudden and absolute. It felt like a physical weight, a velvet shroud that pressed against my eyes. I could hear the wind again, that high-pitched metallic whine from the surface, like a hungry wolf at the door. The temperature in the hole began its rapid descent, but as I leaned my back against the stones, I felt a faint, steady warmth. The thermal battery was discharging. I took the 2 warmest stones and tucked them into my armpits, right over the axillary artery. This is one of the primary heat exchange points in the human body. By warming the blood as it passes through the armpits and the groin, you can effectively heat the entire body's core from the inside out. The warmth was subtle, but it was enough to stop the shivering for a moment. This was the thermal bridge, the connection between the Earth's stored energy and my own metabolic survival. But the silence in the hole was becoming deafening. At 40, there are no insects, no rodents, no sounds of life. Even the ground doesn't move. It's cryogenic stasis. I closed my eyes and tried to slow my breathing. In survival, your breath is a waste of heat and water. I began a box breathing pattern. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds hold, 4 seconds out, 4 seconds hold. This serves 2 purposes. It conserves moisture, and it triggers the parasympathetic nervous system, lowering my heart rate and reducing my caloric burn. But the mind is a dangerous place in the dark. In extreme cold, the brain's cognitive function begins to slow down. Cold-induced lethargy is a real phenomenon. You start to feel sleepy. You start to feel comfortable. This is the terminal burrowing phase, a last-ditch effort by the brain to find a warm place to die. People in the final stages of hypothermia often strip off their clothes, a phenomenon called paradoxical undressing, because their blood vessels suddenly dilate, giving them a false sensation of burning heat. I had to stay awake. I had to keep my metabolic fire burning. I began to recite technical survival data out loud. The specific heat of granite, the thermal conductivity of air, the 3 stages of hypothermia. Mild, shivering and loss of fine motor skills. Moderate, slurred speech, blue skin, and cognitive decline. Severe, loss of consciousness, irregular heartbeat, and death. I was currently at mild. I had to keep it there. I was a human calculator, running the numbers on my own survival. Act 5. The caloric cocktail and the regeneration of the human engine. I was now 4 hours into my sub-zero survival. The thermal stones were cooling, and my own core temperature was entering a slow, dangerous decline. I was shivering again, a violent, teeth-chattering rhythmic spasm that consumed a massive amount of my body's remaining fuel. To survive the night, I had to eat. I had a single energy bar, frozen solid as a brick. Eating in extreme cold is a complex metabolic calculation. Digestion is a thermogenic process. Your body creates heat as it breaks down food. Protein has the highest specific dynamic action, SDA. It increases your metabolic rate by about 25 to 30% just by digesting it. Fats and carbohydrates are lower, around 5–15%. But I had to be careful. Eating too much at once would pull blood away from my extremities and my skin to the digestive system, a phenomenon called splanchnic hyperemia. This can paradoxically make you feel colder in the short term. I broke the energy bar into small, pea-sized pieces. I held each piece in my mouth, letting the saliva warm and soften it before swallowing. This is pre-digestion. It saves energy for the stomach. I was performing a caloric infusion. Each small piece was a tiny packet of glucose and protein that would feed my shivering muscles. I felt the sugar hit my bloodstream, a brief, glorious surge of warmth that felt like a localized sun rising in my chest. But with the food came another problem. I needed to move. At 40, the muscles in your legs and arms begin to stiffen as the blood is pulled toward the core. If I stayed still, I was inviting peripheral stagnation, the beginning of deep tissue frostbite. I began to perform isometrics, muscle contractions without joint movement. I squeezed my glutes. I clenched my fists. I pushed my feet against the walls of the hole. This generated heat without the cooling effect of heavy breathing or sweat. Sweat is the ultimate survival sin. If you sweat in 40, you are dead. The moisture will soak your clothing and then freeze, turning your insulation into an ice jacket. I was walking a razor's edge. I had to generate enough heat to stay alive, but not enough to trigger the body's cooling mechanism. I checked my fingers. They were still pale, but I could move them. I had capillary refill. If I pressed on my fingernail, the pink color returned in less than 2 seconds. That was my biometric for survival. But the hole itself was changing. The air was becoming heavier. The carbon dioxide level in the hole was rising. I could feel a dull, rhythmic throb in my temples, the first sign of hypercapnia. I looked up at the entrance. The narrow opening I'd left for air exchange was beginning to frost over. The moisture from my breath was crystallizing around the edges of the PVC pipe I'd installed, creating a frost plug. I had to clear the vent. But to do that, I had to leave the relatively warm bubble of the hole and expose myself to the wind chill of the surface. This was a calculated risk. I had to spend 30 seconds in the 60-degree air to save the next 6 hours of my life. I stood up. My knees popped with a sound like dry wood snapping. I pushed against the piece of corrugated metal at the top of the shaft. It was frozen in place. I had to use my shoulder, heaving with everything I had. The metal groaned and slid back. The wind hit me like a physical blow. It was a solid wall of freezing energy that literally took my breath away. I reached for the PVC pipe. It was choked with a thick white hoarfrost, intricate needle-like crystals that were as beautiful as they were deadly. I cleared it with my fingers, the skin of my hand instantly turning white and numb. I pulled the metal cover back into place, sealing myself once more in the dark. I was back in the hole, but I was shivering so violently I could barely sit down. I'd lost a massive amount of thermal energy in those 30 seconds. I was now in a heat debt that I had to pay back immediately. I tucked my frozen hand under my armpit, feeling the cold of my fingers against my chest. The pain was excruciating. It felt like my skin was being flayed by 1,000 tiny knives. This is the re-warming shock. As the cold blood from the extremities flows back to the core, it can cause the heart to skip beats, a phenomenon called afterdrop. I breathed. I held my breath. I waited for the fire to return. Act 6. The acoustic loneliness and the psychology of the abyss. The re-warming shock passed, leaving me drained and hollow. I was now in the deep night. Time doesn't exist in a hole at 40. There is only the rhythm of the wind and the rhythm of your own pulse. One of the most dangerous aspects of extreme survival isn't the environment. It's the psychological degradation. In the dark and the cold, the brain starts to hallucinate. Sensory deprivation, combined with mild hypothermia and hypoxia, lack of oxygen, creates a state of survival psychosis. I started to hear things. The wind began to sound like voices, whispers, a distant engine, my name. This is the brain's pattern recognition system, running in overdrive. In the absence of real information, it creates its own. I had to counteract this by focusing on micro-tasks. In survival, you don't survive the night. You survive the next 5 minutes, then the 5 minutes after that. I began to organize my toolbox. I had a knife, a lighter, now empty, a piece of PVC pipe, some scraps of insulation, and a few stones. I began to rearrange them on the floor of my hole, feeling their shapes in the dark. This is tactile anchoring. It keeps the mind grounded in the physical reality of the situation. I then began to think about acoustic insulation. The sound of the wind was constant, a psychological assault that was wearing down my resolve. I decided to use some of the discarded material to create an acoustic baffle at the base of the entrance shaft. By layering the cardboard and some loose earth, I could dampen the sound waves entering the chamber. The silence that followed was shocking. It was an absolute heavy silence, the kind of silence you only find in deep caves or vacuum. In this silence, I could hear my own body working. I could hear the slosh of the water in my stomach. I could hear the faint, high-pitched ring of my nervous system. This is the biofeedback loop. When you are this close to the edge, your body's signals are your only map. I was listening for the warning signs. If my shivering stopped and I still felt cold, that's the critical threshold. It means the body has given up on active thermogenesis. If I started to feel confused or euphoric, that's the sign of deep brain cooling. To keep my brain sharp, I began to do mental math. I calculated the dew point of the air in the hole. I estimated the caloric burn rate based on my heart rate. I was turning my survival into a series of equations. I also started to think about the physics of the snow blanket. If it was snowing at the surface, and it sounded like it was, the layer of snow on top of my corrugated metal cover would actually be a huge benefit. Snow is about 90% trapped air. It has an incredibly high R value, about R1 per inch. If a foot of snow accumulated over my hole, it would create a subnivean environment. The temperature in the hole would stabilize regardless of the wind chill above. I was literally being buried alive, and that was the best thing that could happen to me. But with the snow came the risk of total enclosure. If the snow blocked my air vent, I wouldn't have to worry about the cold anymore. I would just drift into a CO2-induced sleep. I had to keep a monitor on my air supply. I used my knife to hang a small piece of plastic film near the Venturi vent. If it was moving, the air was flowing. If it stopped, I was in trouble. I watched the plastic film in the dim, ghostly light of the frost on the walls. It flickered. A tiny, rhythmic dance of life. I was 6 hours in. I was half frozen, starving, and buried under a layer of industrial waste and snow. But I was still thinking. I was still calculating. And, in the world of 40, thinking is the only thing that keeps you from becoming part of the landscape. Act 7. The metabolic desperation and the body's final reserves. The human body is an incredible machine, but it's a machine with a very strict fuel-to-air ratio. By the 7th hour, I had exhausted my glycogen stores, the high-octane sugar stored in my liver and muscles. I was now entering ketosis. My body was beginning to break down its own fat stores to create energy. This is a slower, less efficient process than burning glucose. It produces ketones, which have a distinct fruity smell. In a small hole, I could smell my own body eating itself. But there's a limit to how fast you can burn fat. And at 40, the energy required to maintain a core temperature of 37 degrees is immense. I was losing the battle. My shivering had changed. It was no longer the rhythmic hunting spasms. It was now a deep, constant vibration in my core, the metabolic final stand. I was experiencing cold-induced diuresis. As the body constricts blood flow to the extremities, the blood pressure in the core increases. The kidneys respond by filtering out more water, leading to a desperate need to urinate. This is a survival catch-22. If you urinate, you lose a half-liter of warm fluid, precious thermal mass that your body spent calories to heat. But if you hold it, your body has to keep spending energy to keep that fluid warm. I had to make a choice. I chose to empty my bladder into the cold sump I'd dug earlier. The steam that rose from the sump was a visual reminder of how much heat I was losing. It was a literal drain on my resources. I was also feeling the effects of hypoglycemia, low blood sugar. My vision was blurring. My thoughts were becoming sticky. I found myself staring at the wall for minutes at a time, forgetting what I was doing. I had one more thing in my pocket, a small packet of salt. In survival, salt is as important as water. It maintains electrolyte balance and helps the cells regulate their own temperature. I opened the packet and poured a small amount onto my tongue. The sharp, bitter taste snapped my brain back into focus. I then did something radical. I began to self-massage. By rubbing my thighs and my abdomen, I was manually stimulating blood flow and creating friction heat. It was a pathetic, slow-motion struggle, but it kept me from slipping into the lethargy zone. I was also monitoring my skin turgor, pinching the skin on the back of my hand to see how fast it snapped back. It was slow. I was severely dehydrated. Every breath I took in the dry, sub-zero air was stealing more water from my system. The snow cave effect was now fully active. I could tell by the sound. The roar of the wind had been replaced by a low, rhythmic thrum, the sound of the earth breathing. The temperature in the hole had stabilized at around 5 degrees Celsius. This is the survivable middle ground. 5 degrees Celsius is still freezing, but it's a tropical paradise compared to 40 degrees Celsius with a wind chill. In this temperature, my insulation was finally able to do its job. I was no longer losing heat faster than I could produce it. I was in a steady state, but steady state doesn't mean safety. It just means a slower death. I lay there in the dark, my breath creating a tiny cloud of steam that I watched by the faint light of the frost. I was a speck of consciousness trapped in a frozen tomb, held together by nothing more than a few thousand calories of body fat and a stubborn refusal to stop breathing. I thought about the surface. The stars would be incredible, the kind of sharp, piercing lights you only see when the atmosphere is frozen solid. But they were lights from another world. My world was 3 feet wide and smelled of damp clay and ketosis. I checked my watch. 3 a.m. This is the hour of the wolf, the time when body temperature naturally dips to its lowest point in the circadian cycle. This was the most dangerous moment. If I could make it through the next 2 hours, the sun would rise. And while the sun wouldn't bring much warmth to a hole in the ground, it would bring the psychological dawn, the hope that makes the impossible possible. I closed my eyes. Just for a second. I had to be careful. In the hole, a second can easily turn into forever. Act 8. The crystal ceiling and the physics of subsurface convection. I woke up with a start. My heart was racing. I had microslept, a survival mechanism where the brain shuts down for a few seconds to preserve energy. But in this environment, it felt like waking up from a dream of being buried. The air in the hole had changed again. It was incredibly still, but there was a new sensation, a faint, pulsing warmth on my face. I looked up. The frost on the ceiling of the hole had grown. It was no longer just a thin layer. It was a forest of hoar frost crystals, some an inch long. They were beautiful, jagged structures that looked like frozen lightning. But as I watched, one of the crystals fell. It didn't melt. It just shattered on my jacket. I realized what was happening. My body heat, however meager, was creating a thermal plume, a column of warm air that rose to the ceiling, hit the freezing surface, and created a cycle of microconvection. This was the convection loop. The warm air rose, cooled against the ceiling, and then dropped back down along the walls. This cycle was slowly building a layer of ice on every surface of the hole, except for the floor where I sat. I was effectively glazing my own shelter. This layer of ice was acting as an air barrier, sealing the microscopic cracks in the clay and making my hole even more airtight. But the air was getting thin. I could feel the air hunger now, a deep, instinctive need to breathe faster. The CO2 levels were reaching the point of respiratory acidosis. My blood was becoming slightly more acidic as it struggled to expel the excess carbon dioxide. I had to check the vent again. Moving was even harder now. My joints felt like they had been filled with cold grease. Every movement required a conscious effort of will. I had to torque my muscles into moving. Left hand, grab the rock, right foot, push. I climbed back up the shaft. The snow blanket I'd predicted was there. I could feel the weight of it on the corrugated metal. It must have been 6 or 8 inches deep. I pushed against the metal. It didn't move. A surge of panic hit me. This is the survival trap, the moment when your own defenses become your cage. The snow had drifted against the metal, and the heat from my hole had caused the bottom layer to melt and then refreeze, welding the metal to the rim of the shaft. I was sealed in. I sat back down at the bottom of the hole. I had to stay calm. Panic burns oxygen. Panic raises the heart rate. Panic is the fastest way to die in a hole. I analyzed the problem from a mechanical engineering perspective. I had a lever, the PVC pipe. I had a fulcrum, the edge of the concrete wall. I had a force, my own body weight. I didn't try to push the metal up. I tried to slide it. I jammed the PVC pipe into the gap between the metal and the wall and pulled. Nothing. I tried again using my shoulder as a battering ram. I could hear the ice cracking, a sharp splintering sound that echoed in the tiny chamber. On the third try, the metal gave way with a loud crack. A small amount of snow tumbled into the hole, looking like powdered diamonds in the dim light. I reached up and cleared the snow away from the vent. The fresh air hit my face, and I felt a sudden, dizzying rush of oxygen. My brain felt like it was being plugged into a charger. The sky was no longer purple. It was a pale, sickly gray. The civil twilight, the period before sunrise. I had survived the night. The temperature at the surface was still well below 30, but the thermal tide was turning. I sat back down in my ice-glazed tomb. I was exhausted. My body felt like it had been through a car crash. Every muscle ached from the hours of constant tension and shivering. But I was alive. I had used physics, biology, and a little bit of desperate engineering to beat a 40-degree environment with nothing but a hole in the ground. I looked at my hands. They were gray and wrinkled from the humidity and the cold. I couldn't feel the tips of my fingers, but they weren't black. I had survived without losing a single digit. I reached for my water tin. It was frozen solid. I tucked it against my belly, hoping to melt a few drops for the final push. I was no longer a victim of the cold. I was a thermal predator, hunting for every last degree of warmth in a frozen world. Act 9. The infrared dawn and the recovery of the world. The first light of the sun didn't bring warmth, but it brought information. As the light filtered through the thin layer of snow over my hole, the world inside changed from a place of textures to a place of colors. The ice crystals on the walls weren't just white, they were prismatic, scattering the weak morning light into tiny rainbows. The ice glaze I'd created was now a translucent shell, making my hole look like the inside of a geode. I checked my watch. 7:30 a.m. The solar flux was beginning. Even at this latitude, and in this temperature, the sun's infrared radiation was hitting the surface. While the air temperature wouldn't rise above 25 all day, the direct solar gain on my black jacket would be significant. I needed to get out of the hole, but I had to do it strategically. This is the final transition. Leaving a stabilized thermal environment is dangerous. My body was currently adjusted to the 5 degrees Kelvin of the hole. Stepping back into the 30°C air with a wind chill would be a thermal shock to my system. I needed to prepare my engine. I began to do vigorous isometrics, pumping my blood and raising my core temperature. I wanted to be running hot when I hit the surface. I also had to deal with the decompression. Moving from a low oxygen, high CO2 environment to fresh air can cause a temporary drop in blood pressure, leading to fainting. I stood up slowly, keeping my head low until I felt stable. I pushed the metal cover aside completely. The world above was a blinding monochromatic desert of white and blue. The wind was still there, but it had lost some of its jagged nighttime edge. I climbed out. The transition was brutal. The air felt thin and sharp, like breathing in needles. My lungs instantly revolted, triggering a coughing fit that felt like my chest was being crushed. This is exercise-induced bronchospasm, the lungs' reaction to the extreme temperature differential. I stood on the edge of the hole and looked back down. It looked so small, a tiny, dark scar in the snow. It was hard to believe that 3-foot-wide space had been the difference between life and death. I looked at the horizon. The industrial site was still a graveyard of rusted metal, but in the morning light, it looked less like a tomb and more like a map. I could see the outlines of a road, a distant line of power poles, and the silhouette of a building that might have an intact roof and maybe a telephone. I began to walk. Walking in deep snow at 30 is an aerobic nightmare. Every step is a caloric tax. I had to find the optimal path, the areas where the wind had scoured the snow down to the hard-packed ice or gravel. I was using visual navigation. I looked for leading lines, the power poles and the road, to keep my movement efficient. Every unnecessary step was a waste of precious energy. I was also monitoring my core feedback. If I started to sweat, I stopped and unzipped my jacket slightly. If I felt my shivering return, I picked up the pace. I was my own thermostat. The sun was now fully above the horizon. I could feel the faint warmth on my back. This is radiant heat. Even if the air is freezing, the sun's energy can be absorbed by dark surfaces. I tilted my head back, letting the light hit my face. It felt like a benediction. But I was fading. The ketosis was no longer enough. My muscles were beginning to cramp, a sign of severe electrolyte depletion and dehydration. My legs felt like lead. I reached the first power pole. I leaned against it, my breath coming in ragged, freezing gasps. I was less than a mile from what looked like a maintenance shack. In survival, the last mile is always the hardest. This is where mental fatigue overtakes physical endurance. The brain, seeing the goal, starts to shut down early, leading to fatal mistakes. I had to stay sharp. I began to count my steps. 1, 2, 3, 10. Every 10 steps was a victory. Every 10 steps was 10 steps closer to a world that wasn't trying to kill me. I was moving through a landscape of absolute zero, a human spark trying not to go out. Act 10. The resurrection of the senses and the lessons of the deep freeze. The maintenance shack was closer than it looked. In the thin, freezing air, distance is deceptive. This is atmospheric clarity. Without dust or humidity to scatter the light, objects appear sharper and closer than they actually are. I reached the door. It was heavy, painted a faded industrial green. I grabbed the handle. Metal at 30 is a thermal magnet. If my hand had been wet, the skin would have bonded instantly to the handle, a flash freeze. But my hands were dry, and my gloves, though worn, provided enough of a barrier. The door was locked. In that moment, the weight of the last 12 hours hit me. I felt a surge of cortisol-induced despair. I had survived the hole, the wind, and the 40-degree night, only to be stopped by a piece of steel. But survival isn't about hope. It's about applied physics. I looked at the lock. It was a simple padlock. In extreme cold, metal becomes brittle. The ductile to brittle transition means that steel loses its ability to deform and instead shatters under impact. I looked around the base of the shack. I found a heavy iron bar, a piece of discarded rebar. I used it as a hammer. I struck the padlock with everything I had left. The sound was like a gunshot. On the second hit, the shackle of the lock didn't bend. It snapped like a piece of glass. I pushed the door open. The air inside the shack was still cold, probably 10, but it was dead air. No wind, no snow. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. The silence was different here. It wasn't the heavy, crushing silence of the hole. It was the silence of shelter. I found a workbench. I sat down on a wooden stool. The sensation of sitting on a raised surface, not on the ground, not in a hole, felt like the height of luxury. I looked at my reflection in a dusty window. I didn't recognize the man looking back. My face was a mask of frost and grime. My eyes were bloodshot from the CO2 and the cold. I looked like a ghost that had crawled out of the earth. I found a small electric heater under the workbench. I plugged it in. The sound of the fan starting up was the most beautiful music I've ever heard. As the coils began to glow orange, the smell of dust and heat filled the room. This was the final rewarming. I sat 3 feet away from the heater. You never put frozen limbs directly on a heat source. That leads to thermal injury and can cause the heart to stop as the cold blood rushes back too quickly. You have to warm up incrementally. As the heat hit my skin, the pain returned. This is the thaw. It's a deep, agonizing ache that feels like your bones are being ground into powder. It's the sound of the nerves waking up and reporting the damage. But as the pain faded, it was replaced by a profound, sensory awakening. I could feel the texture of my clothes. I could smell the old oil on the workbench. I could hear the hum of the heater. I was no longer in survival mode. I was in recovery. I found a telephone on the wall, a dial tone, the sound of a world that still worked. I dialed for help. As I waited for the operator to pick up, I looked out the window at the industrial wasteland. The hole was out there somewhere, hidden by the snow. It had been my grave, my laboratory, and ultimately my sanctuary. I had learned that survival isn't a battle of man against nature. It's a negotiation. You don't fight the 40-degree cold, you work around its rules. You use its own physics, convection, conduction, and radiation to carve out a space for life. The human body is a furnace, the mind is a calculator, and the earth is a battery. If you know how to connect them, you can survive anything. The operator answered. Emergency services. What is your location? I took a deep breath of the warm, dusty air. I'm at the old quarry maintenance shack, I said. My voice was raspy but steady. I've been out all night. I'm cold. But I'm alive. As I hung up the phone, I realized that I would never look at a hole in the ground the same way again. Act 11. The metabolic aftermath and the permanent shift. The rescue took 45 minutes to arrive. In that time, I didn't just sit. I continued my biological audit. I checked my core temperature using a thermometer I found in the shack's first aid kit. 35.5 degrees Celsius. I was technically in stage 1 hypothermia, but I was trend line positive. My body was winning the war. When the paramedics finally burst through the door, they expected to find a corpse or a man in a state of metabolic collapse. Instead, they found me sitting on the stool, drinking a cup of tepid water I'd found in a sealed jug, watching the heater. They wrapped me in active heating blankets and began the in-transit assessment. You were out there all night? One of them asked, his eyes wide as he looked at the reading on his handheld weather station. The local airport recorded 42 at 4 a.m. I nodded. I stayed in a hole. He laughed, but it wasn't a laugh of mockery. It was a laugh of incredulity. A hole? Man, you should have been a popsicle by midnight. I didn't try to explain the R values of clay or the convection loops of hoar frost. I just leaned back and let the warmth of the ambulance envelope me. In the hospital, they ran a full biochemical profile. My lactate levels were high, a sign of the massive muscular effort of shivering. My creatinine was elevated, showing the stress on my kidneys. I had electrolyte imbalance and severe dehydration, but my brain was clear. My heart was strong. I had avoided afterdrop, the dangerous condition where the cold blood from the extremities rushes back to the heart during rewarming, causing cardiac arrest. For days afterward, my metabolism stayed in high gear. I was constantly hungry, my body demanding the calories it had burned to keep that furnace running in the hole. I was eating 5,000 calories a day and still losing weight. This is post-survival hypermetabolism. But the physical recovery was the easy part. The neurological shift was more profound. Once you have negotiated with absolute 0 and 1, your perspective on comfort changes forever. A thermostat set to 20 degrees C isn't just a convenience. It's a life support system. A wool sweater isn't just clothing, it's engineered insulation. A piece of bread isn't just food, it's chemical energy. I began to see the world through the lens of thermodynamics. Every building is a thermal envelope. Every person is a biological heat engine. Every moment of peace is a steady state that must be protected. The lessons of the whole stayed with me. I spent the next year documenting the physics of the clay-stabilized Earth shelter. I worked with engineers to understand the passive geothermal properties that had kept me at 5 degrees Celsius when the world was 40 degrees Celsius. We discovered that my hole had benefited from the thermal mass of the industrial site's concrete foundation. The ground wasn't just dirt, it was a heat sink that had been absorbing the weak autumn sun for months, and I had tapped into that stored energy just in time. I also realized that my ventilation strategy had been more critical than I knew. If I had made the hole too airtight, I would have died of CO2 poisoning before midnight. If I had made the vent too large, the convection tax would have sucked the heat out of my body in minutes. I had found the survival narrow way by instinct and desperation. To the world, it's just a void. To me, it was the place where I learned what it means to be truly, viscerally alive. The deep freeze was over. The lesson was complete. Final summary: the survivalist's creed. If you ever find yourself caught in the deep freeze, remember the hierarchy of survival. 1. Biological awareness. Monitor your engine. If you stop shivering, you're in trouble. 2. Physical engineering. Use the earth battery. A hole is a shelter. A grave is only a hole you give up on. 3. Atmospheric physics. Manage your thermal plume. Trap the heat, but don't choke on the gas. The world is a harsh laboratory, but the rules of universal physics are always the same. If you follow the rules will save your life. Thank you for watching. If this story provided value to your survival knowledge, hit that subscribe button. Join our community of survivors who understand that knowledge is the ultimate insulation. Share this with someone who needs to know that even in the darkest, coldest hole, there is always a way out. And remember, the furnace is in your chest, but the map is in your mind. Stay warm. Stay alive.